Welcome to another episode. We got JD Long here from RenaissanceRe. Does all things data for those guys. And I was telling him before we jumped on, but it's had a lot of his tweets or stuff on LinkedIn and everything has had a pretty big impact on how I kind of view data or how I try to have us do data at Grayson Mill. So really excited to have you on and pick your brain and just kind of hear some good stories. I know you're quite the character, so.
I'm excited to be here. I started and I don't know why I'm here. I don't do that much energy. So, okay. But I do a lot of data. So happy to talk about it.
Yeah, no, because we're always trying to, figure out what are people using to solve problems? What are different tools? And I think sometimes you get that cross-functional knowledge. I mean, there's obviously things that you've done or can glean, we can glean insights from. So, we try to stick to energy in general, but again, I think you're just a good, generalist and have experience across the spectrum. So,
you bet. This will be the cross-pollination episode. I'm down with it.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, we had someone, 2 weeks ago, John, that works for a tractor tech company.
Yeah, he works in ag tech.
They're doing
fantastic.
Ag tech. So, again, I think it all comes across. I mean, you need energy for everything. It all, it all comes back around.
And everyone has data that they need to do something with, or they think they need to do something with it.
Mm-hmm. Plenty of it, too much, depending on how you look at it. But I mean, with that, we, a lot of new technology out there, and obviously AI is kind of the new hotness. And JD, I saw you reposted this maybe yesterday, but about the Baltimore high school athletic director who used AI to basically clone his principal's voice and basically slander him by making it sound like he said racist things. And he actually got fired for a few months.
Yeah, they put him on leave for a few months and did an investigation. The FBI and CIA got involved, and then they figured out that the audio was fake. And they now turn around and fired the coach.
It's pretty insane that on the one hand, it's awful and it's abysmal and it's immoral. On the other hand, the technology's gotten good enough that that the coaches can figure out how to do it. That's kind of mass market if there ever was mass market, right? So a lot of
100%.
These tooling have I think gotten surprisingly user accessible.
Yeah, you can go on 11 Labs right now and clone my voice very, very quickly. Although,
have you guys done that yet?
Yeah,
have you all tried it?
I have not personally, but.
How'd you find it, John?
This was probably 6 months ago, so I haven't tested it since. But it was the thing I noticed about the audio is it does not do a good job of cadence and tone as well. I have noticed recently that they've started getting better about putting in ums and pauses and trying to get more natural kind of cadence or whatever. But that being said, the audio when I was talking, generally, absolutely, if my parents answered a phone and heard that, they probably would think it was me, right? It's super scary to think about, especially
have you guys established have you established a safe word with your family so that someone doesn't hijack
really
you and then do the whole I'm in jail, you got to send money to whatever address,
Target gift cards.
Yeah, Target gift cards. I'm in
Belize. It's no longer going to be the Nigerian prince sending you a text. It's they're going to have your voice, and it's pretty scary. Who was it? I was talking to this guy Talal was our first guest actually, and I had lunch with him this week, and he was telling me about another thing where I guess someone used Zoom and was able to replicate and his boss. This was a bank, and it was to wire. Maybe 7 figures or something like that. And so he got the initial message from his boss and they said, hey, I need you to wire this money. And he's like, I don't know if this is true. So he sent well, let's jump on a Zoom call. And so he jumped on the Zoom call and this person was able to replicate a bunch of his coworkers being in the room also.
Whoa.
So it was he felt like he was there with his boss and the guy wired the money.
Yeah. I was talking to an executive with an insurance company who they had a situation that was close to this, and they got on the video call, and we're going to do okay, I'm going to text you. So then you got the video call, you got live, and then you've got text connection between each person. And they figured out they were being scammed and it all just went away. But it's we need to rethink our trust network of, how do you literally do transfer of large amounts of money as a business anymore?
Yeah. Yeah, you essentially need a 2FA for that within your company. That's
exactly right.
The technical 2FA.
Right.
Well, and I think without saying too much, because it's his idea, Talal is thinking about something along those lines too. It's but I think even now he's like, if you get a call from me, because he's got a small company, so like if one of his coworkers, basically when a new employee comes on, someone's already sending him, hey, this is Talal, go to Target and get a bunch of Apple gift cards. But he's like, if you get any even call that sounds like it's me and you don't think it's legit, say, hey, I'm going to hang up and call you back, because I think people can spoof the number one way, but they can't.
You can't spoof it the other way, right?
Yeah,
right.
And but no, I mean, the AI stuff's gonna be crazy, but it's one of those like some people are like, well, we just got to shut this down. It's gonna be too dangerous. Well, guess what? I mean, the nefarious people are gonna have it. Yeah. And like, I mean, China, Russia, doesn't matter. It's gonna be weaponized. So I mean, I think the only thing that's gonna beat AI is probably AI.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's just like, they have forensics on media already, right?
Right.
To be able to tell like geolocation, if it was photoshopped or any of that stuff, like that will happen at some point, or there will be mandates where you have to put something in the code, or like even with GPT, I saw an article a while ago where they were like, there was a specific word, and they were talking about kids plagiarizing using GPT or whatever, and they were like, there was one specific word that if GPT exceeded so many characters, it almost always included, and so they could literally just go find. Like that was the first filter, right? And then there's all kinds of other stuff. Or I also think the teachers are getting good at it as well, where they put in, they hide text within their summary or whatever, the assignment, so that when the student copy and pastes it in there, it shows up white on the document, but they copy and paste it in there and hit enter, and then it shows up. It's like, make sure to include this specific term somewhere in this document every time, so it always ends up in the output.
And then that's the tell.
Yeah, and that's the tell.
Yeah. Well, we got a bunch of decisions we got to make, right? Collectively as a culture and individually. My daughter is in junior year of high school now, and I guess I can't remember if this was the end of last year or beginning of this year. She wanted to talk about ethical AI. And I was like, what the hell? Like, I didn't see that coming. She's like, I got an assignment and I didn't understand what they meant when they asked, like, I want you to write an essay that contrasts this to this. And I didn't understand what that type of assignment meant. Can I put that in AI and ask it to give me an example of that type? I'm not going to copy and paste it. I want to use it to show me the type of writing structure. And I'm like, ooh. She said, our school has a strict no AI policy. What does that mean? I'm not going to copy and paste it. I just want it to show me a structure, an example of how you'd answer this type of question. I'm like, this is a really good point, because it's not clear.
Yeah. Well, and that's one way, in my opinion, and I use it with code all the time. Where
I do too.
That is such a great tool for let the GPT, the language model, whichever flavor you like, explain and teach you things in a simpler way. Or like, I would be so much better at engineering if I had this when I was in college, and I could have it walk me through thermodynamics instead of just getting here's the 200 pages you have to read this week and 10 assignments, and you're drinking from a water hose. You can't comprehend half of the material that you actually get. And so having a tool like this, where it's like, you can do it on your own time, it can give you examples, you can break things down. Like, it's really fascinating. But to your point, it's like, how do you use it for good, but not
in an ethical way?
Right.
And then there's this ethical, and then ethical in the way that your boss or your school or whatever approves of, right? Because I could argue about ethics in the abstract, but my daughter's school may not agree with me.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And that's tricky. So, one of the skills from pre-AI right now, I think Stack Overflow is really catching a bunch of heat, because they've licensed with OpenAI to include this. And some folks have tried to take their answers down from Stack Overflow because they don't want it used for training these models. And Stack Overflow is not letting them, basically putting it back up and blocking the users or locking their accounts. And so folks are feeling intense about this. The irony I see, or I guess the coincidence I see, is actually what makes me good with ChatGPT with coding is the same skill of why I have a really high ranking on Stack Overflow. And it's this idea of a reproducible small example. because the single biggest mistake when folks come to these language models is they give them too much crap.
Yep.
They'll try to put like whole block, hundreds of lines of code in. I'm like, no. What you want to do is try to figure out how to solve the little piece. And you want to explain that piece and say, I'm trying to do this, and then build that up. So it's not, don't think of it as building your house for you. Think of it as building the Lego blocks. And then you got to stack them together, or you got to link them together.
It's got to be iterative. Yeah. It works so much better when you iterate through it. Start with the smallest, like if you're specifically for coding, that's mostly what I use it for. But like start with the smallest thing. Okay, I want to call this API. All right, then get it to write the script to call the API. Okay, now I want to put that API into a data frame. Right. Then you get it to do that, and you just build on it instead of
you build on it. That's exactly right.
Hey, I want to call this, put it in the data frame, do this. Like instead of doing it all straight down, they're still not that great at the reasoning and thought process.
And I'm sure, JD, are you using GitHub Copilot at all, or no?
I have used it just briefly, and I like the conversational thing that John referenced so much that I actually, after using it for a little while, I kind of went back to ChatGPT because there was an impedance mismatch between how I wanted to use the tool and how Copilot was built. And I've watched some of our developers kind of feel the opposite. They just want to put comments in and get like spicy autocomplete. And I'm like, I kind of want to do something a little more conversational, more iterative, because I feel like the single shot sort of approach, it's not as good at. And maybe that's just, I'm not a very good explainer, right? So I need to iterate with it. So I like the more iterative conversational thing. Now I'm working on a book about using these models for data science. And it's really about this, fancy prompt engineering. And one of the things my co-author and I have struggled at is when we're doing that thing you and I just discussed, what do we call that?
That's a great
it's not conversation, or is it? Or is that too much anthropomorphizing? Right. Like we've sort of leaned towards iterative inquiry, but that almost feels too cute.
Yeah.
Or something like, I can't figure out what the hell do we call it? What are we doing?
No, that's very true.
That's fair.
You should definitely check out cursor.sh.
Cursor.sh.
That's what I've been using here recently. And I think it's built on VS Code in some form or fashion. But they have their own, they're funded by, or they have funding from OpenAI, but they have their own model built in, but you can also link Claude and GPT into it. But it's your VS Code window and then the chat right next to it. And you can reference code and it pulls it directly into the chat.
Nice.
It will generate code and then it'll ask you, do you want to implement it? And it will go through your actual code line by line, change it, and then you get to tell it yes or no. Like it's exactly what I was doing with GPT, but it's faster because it's just all right there.
More tightly coupled, right? It links them right there together. Yeah, I need to look at that. That sounds like a good idea.
It's cool.
Total geek question here. Have you ever used a foot pedal with your computer?
I have not.
Not for anything other than gaming.
Than video games? Yeah. Well, I kind of got this idea off of, I think the hardcore text editor folks, Emacs folks or Vim folks will use the foot pedal for certain keystrokes. So you don't have to stretch your fingers, right? Things that you use a lot. And I went online and found a used transcriptionist foot pedal. And it didn't have drivers for Mac, so I had to write enough Python to like sniff the USB ports. So it went down a dirty yak shaving hole. But in the end, I got it where I can press and hold and start voice to text for dictation. And then when I let up, it stops. So I can just be typing and then press my foot and switch to doing it by voice and then let off. And one of the things I've been experimenting with is doing like brain dumps, like, the conversation you have with yourself in the shower about a topic, kind of dumping that and then giving that to like ChatGPT with I have a very long prompt of what to do with this, but basically don't change the intent, but try to word so that it sounds like me and has my style. But basically see if I can go from brain dump babbling to something that actually reads thought through, but you still got to go back and read it because you still got to go back and then I've edited heavily because there is that whole working out your thought as you capture it. And I think folks sometimes forget that that's like, the whole thoughts detangle themselves on the tip of a pen. In the combination of saying it and then writing it, you're working it out. And what I want to do is just work it out faster. Yeah. But I don't think I'm going to be able to just skip a bunch of steps, because that is the process, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, Colin, our CEO, they've got a big kind of walking trail and stuff, but in his neighborhood, and he will go on walks and just talk to GPT and have it just via AirPods and have it record everything and then summarize it, bullet it, outline it, whatever he needs to do. And it's that's the coolest part, I think, of this tech is like people overhype what it's capable of doing, but they sleep on all of these. Like, I'm sure we'll talk about data science applications, just like everyday applications, or like just what we were talking about with your daughter, like having it teach you how to do things,
how
or
to do something.
Yeah. Like it's like YouTube on steroids, right? Like,
well, the thing I have seen as a learner is often I don't know enough to ask a good question.
Yes.
And so there's a bootstrapping problem to learning. Because if you kind of know the idea, you at least know what to Google for, what you're looking for. You have a framework in your head. When I'm totally starting something new, I often don't have the vocabulary. Mm-hmm. I don't have a framework of how to talk about it. I don't feel confident enough to bother an expert with tell me how to think about this. They're going, what the hell are you even asking me? And I'm like, well, I don't know enough to ask a better question, but ChatGPT will do it. If I'm thinking about this topic, what are the big ideas I should be thinking about?
Yep.
And just bootstrap me. And that's shockingly useful. And I think that's the sort of stuff, John, like you're saying, that people are sleeping on.
Yeah.
And maybe it's because we, us and people like us and people listening to this podcast are learning a lot and learning faster than probably your average adult in the US, would be my guess, because we're very much doing stuff that changes rapidly and you got to ingest lots of new information and learn new things. I mean, that's the thing where I see coders saying oh, this isn't useful because if you know your libraries and everything, you're faster. And I just chuckle because I'm like, most developers are not using libraries and syntax that they're absolutely completely fluent in all aspects.
No.
I am sure there are a few folks who have been writing C++ for 40 years and they think in it.
Yep.
Yeah.
The rest of us don't.
No.
Or even just the nuances of them, or how they've changed. They change all the time, right? And it's just yes, the base of it, but that doesn't mean you're not going to run into an issue where, whatever, the encoding is messed up or whatever it may be, right? And then
or you're using AWS and there's 15 new tools that you've never heard of that will solve the problem you have, right? So you need some sort of back and forth. This idea that, oh no, if you had the static knowledge, you can just fluently do this, I think is really malformed.
Yeah, I used GPT to walk a directory the other day and delete all the PDFs in it because they were taking up too much space. But have I done that in a year and a half? No. But I asked GPT and it was done in 10 seconds.
Yeah, exactly. I could dilly-dally around and write that on my own and only Googled 15, 20 times. But why? Because it's easily explained, and it's training data as a bunch of examples of something like that.
Exactly.
Similarly, the recursive delete on S3 buckets, where you got to recursively delete everything so because you can't empty something if it has stuff, and you can't delete a directory structure if it has something. And anyway, it's just that's really annoying to do. And to, because I do it so rarely, but to write a little code, and then those contribute to my utilities library of my personal junk that I keep stacked up. But at this point, a bunch of that gets written by ChatGPT, and there's no corporate private information in traverse this structure in S3 and delete files, right?
Or ETL processes or any of the fun stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
So with that, you were to maybe shift gears a little bit, but not 100%. But you were talking a little bit earlier about Vim and Emacs, which are obviously old school kind of code editors. But I know you've had a lot of thoughts on say GUI, versus code, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're generally a fan of stuff that can be stored as plain text, so it's a little more reproducible and going that way. But just what's been your experience? Obviously there's more and more low code tools, and even Tableau, whatever else, Power BI out there. But then why should people use that, or when should they use that versus when should they write code, and tech debt, kind of just a little bit of all that.
Oh yeah, I may have to take my fleece off. Things are about to get spicy.
Let's do it, because I've done a ton of no code stuff, and I have very mixed opinions on it.
All right. I'm interested to hear your experience. I'll share my bias, and then you can push back on what you see differently. So I see no code or low code as an abstraction, and I think Joel Spolsky said, any reasonably sophisticated abstraction leaks. And the way no code leaks, in my experience, has always been you can do somewhere between 75 and 95% of what you want to do in the low code. That's great. And then you want to do something that you can't do with. So you end up with like this code block that ends up having a whole bunch of stuff in it. And at first it's like, oh, well, yeah, it's just 5 or 10%. And then it becomes 25%. And then at some point you're like, oh, I'm doing less than half of it in these no code tools. And I end up pushing all my logic into this code block, which isn't in version control, is locked up inside this tool. And it begins to feel like not an enabling technology, but a capturing technology. And if they didn't leak, or what I wanted to do was trivial, it's kind of like the using AI. It can bootstrap you up to something really fast. The problem I have is after the thing becomes non-trivial, I feel like they're very problematic. Now, if the way I would change my tune on this, and there was actually a tool for R that does this. It was built out in Japan. I can't remember the name of it. I looked it up, but I can't remember it off the top of my head. But the idea is you use a GUI type low code tool, and it writes the R alongside. And
was it exploratory?
Yeah.
There's exploratory.io, which I've used before, which is
I can't remember. It may have been. That rings a bell.
I think it's a.
Well, then.
It's basically
there is the S.
Sorry, Bobby. It's a GUI for data analysis, but it's all built on top of R. And so you can connect to databases, you can pull in files, CSV, et cetera. And then it pulls, your main dashboard, your kind of data management dashboard, just like Power Query or whatever. It shows you each column and, the formats and all of that stuff. But if you do any kind of ETL on it, you can do it through menus, but then it will pull up the window with the R statement, the R code in it. So if you want to modify it at all, then you can. It's actually really powerful for that. With people like me who read code, I'm not a full-time developer, so I don't write a ton of code, but I understand the data side of it. And so it's like, I know how powerful and good R is at data. I want to use R, but I don't want to sit and burn a bunch of time coding just to visualize the data set. It's really, really good.
Well, I always talk when I teach like data analysis, like I always start with like, none of us want to code. We want to solve some freaking problem. Right.
Yeah.
And that's part of the difference between, I think, data analysis folks and maybe folks who become software developers. Because some of the software developers I've worked with in the past, I mean, they just want to code.
Yeah.
They really kind of like to not think about the business problem. They just want to code. Like they want to think about the coding problem. And so if you're in the data analysis world, the mindset's very different. And so when I teach this or talk about it, I'm often like, first of all, we don't want to do this, but it's how we're going to be effective. We want to get something done. All right. Well, if our goal is to get something done, let's drop purity test. I want to cheat. I want to steal. I want to borrow. I'm stopped short of lying, but I'll lie to myself and think I'm smart when I'm really just, using Stack Overflow. I'm using every tool at my disposal. I'm using AI. I want to use all these tools so I can solve problems faster. And, one of the tools that I encourage folks when ththey're just getting started with ggplot, which is plotting library in R, is this tool called Esquisse, which it's a French word that means like to scribble or sketch, I think. I don't speak French, so I'm sure I'm mispronouncing it.
Neither do we. That's okay.
Yeah,
that was the one I was going to bring up too. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, because it actually writes the ggplot code. Like you graphically design a graph and then it gives you the code and then you copy and paste that into your code, or it's got a button that says drop it in there and then you can change it, right? Because it's there in code. Now it becomes an easy on-ramp for coding. And I like that. That's different than being the trap, which is the first scenario I described, where it's like you're stuck in this low code tool, writing more and more code in your one text box for freeform code. Now, how is that different than your experience, John?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you're honestly spot on. I don't think we really disagree much around that stuff. To me, the low code, no code stuff is really good for prototyping. Like if you're in product or tech, if you're trying to just get something out there to see if people like it, to see how it works, to see how it functions, whatever, to test, whatever it may be, it really is a good tool. But you're absolutely hit the nail on the head. We actually just yesterday rolled our platform over from one platform was on Ruby, one was a third-party white label, and the other was on a no-code platform, Bubble. We rolled all of that over to Ruby and formally launched it yesterday. And it's for that very reason, right? Like, hey, we wanted to start doing more sophisticated stuff. And it's like, oh, well, it's got an OAuth integration in Bubble to do single sign-on for your users, but then that goes into like there's no actual integration with Okta or the actual SSO providers. And it's like, oh, well, then how the hell do we do that? Or like, oh, I need for example, another fun problem. The API call to all the data tables works great, but if there's a blank field and that's at the top of the paginated return, it doesn't return the field, even though there's data in rows below it. Just all kinds of
that feels like a bug,
fun garbage like that you have to deal with. Or like the problem with them is they fall into the trap of like, we want to try and ultimately lock people into this. And that's not what people want. They want to use it to develop quickly, spin something up, test, prototype, POC, whatever, and then go do it at scale in some capacity. And you can't do that. For example, in this one, I couldn't. There was all this custom code that you needed to do in order to back it up to SQL. There was no way to back up your tables out of the platform, which is bullshit. It's my data. Yeah. Why can't I move it? And there's an API, right? But it's like they've got all these plugins for everything to ingest APIs or ingest data from a SQL table, but I can't push it back. Like, why? You know?
Yeah. So it's as soon as I smell a moat being artificially constructed, I'm either going to blow it up or I'm going to go around it.
Yeah.
Because the vendors, they want a moat, something to keep, me from leaving or other tools from coming in. And they better add tremendous value.
Yeah.
Because otherwise I'm going to see the moat coming. And I'm like, I either want to go through it or under it, around it, or ditch this tool. And so our interests become disaligned because they want to exploit me and I want to not be exploited. So. Yeah,
no, I think the best versions have kind of a dual function, or the best platforms have that dual functionality where it's like, if you want to do it via GUI, I'm a firm believer of that with any kind of software. You should have at least two ways to do everything, right? Like two menu, but like a drop down menu and then an icon, or a right click and an icon, or code and an icon, like whatever it is.
Right.
And so like, if I want to pull in your plugin and use it, great. But I also want to be able to code that if I need to, or if, stuff like that. Bobby and I used QuickBase for a long time at the company me and him worked together, and they did a very good job of building it. It's kind of like a Salesforce in a way, like it's an ERP-esque system, but they have lots of integrations. It's fully codable in Java under the hood. Like it made it dynamic enough that we could do really interesting custom stuff without having this huge rip and rebuild kind of situation. I also agree with you too wholeheartedly that the best things for like low code stuff is just transforming an existing code and then spitting it out, right? Like ggplot, that's a great example. I wish I knew about that library when I was using R back when Bobby started teaching me about it, because I loved, like, I could transform the data and everything in R, but then I did not want to spend the fucking time building the stupid
sorting
plot
that
code.
Out. And I find when I use ggplot a lot, I kind of think in it.
Yeah.
But even if it's, I'm co-author of the R Cookbook 2nd edition. I mean, I've written books on this stuff. If I hadn't used it for a while, I can't remember.
Right.
I'm just too old for that. And so I have to, use a tool or use, now maybe ChatGPT and just, that's right. I remember now.
Yeah.
And then I'm off to the races. And the other thing I want to mention, we kind of blew past it, but the idea of the low coding tools not being able to put your code in version control, Git or whatever you want to use. That's a big one. for me against those tools. Even Power BI, has this problem of, your code's in there, but it's inside of this thing that's really just a zip file, and you can open it up and there's some weird hacks again in there, but then it's XML when you get it out. So it's like, if you change something, it's in an XML block. It's as ugly as, Jupyter notebooks are in version control, which is pretty ugly. And it's like, these are just, that's an impedance mismatch with how I think I want to work, or how I want a team of people trying to work together.
Yeah.
And I think some of it's like there's a speed thing too. And it's like, I think so sometimes you can build things faster in a BI tool. And sometimes that's necessary for people to get an answer out quick or to do something. But then there's that whole maintenance side of it too. And it's like, actually, if I built a shiny dashboard or a template or something like that, like it may take some time that first time I build it, but then I can build off of it, and then I can reuse that and do things more quickly and more sustainably going forward.
Well, this is really one of I think the hard problems in kind of the stuff people like us do, is asking the question, what shape is my problem?
Yeah.
That's shockingly hard, and it sounds kind of dumb when I say it out loud. Like, what do you mean? That should be easy. But
there's so many stakeholders involved there. Like normally, right? Like my CEO wants everything done yesterday, and he wants it done as cheap as possible, and he wants the answer now. And it's like, well, if you want me to do this at scale 100 times, it's going to take a little bit for me to set it up so we can do all that, right? But if you just need a quick and dirty answer, I'll export it and pull it into Power BI and pull it up for you, right? Like,
or I'll just pivot it in Excel or something, right?
Exactly.
Like, and it's this idea of a one-off versus building a machine that will answer this question, into the future. That's what a bunch of us face, is that design pattern. The other thing I was thinking about, like the shape of the problem, is I have seen people approach any problem where there's numbers being presented as that's a Power BI problem or graphs. And I tell you what, you can write, I thought I'd seen some monstrosities written in Excel where people are basically building applications, but Excel's their only hammer, so they drive every nail with it. It's like, VBA. Oh, sweet Jesus. Just VBA out the wazoo, and, all kinds of modal forms and everything. And you can do the same thing with Power BI.
Yep.
And it doesn't, just because you can doesn't mean you should. And they end up with huge number of, DAX transformations. When, if you look at it and you're like, okay, if you just were to take a step back, I could write a query for this, and then we could write a query for this piece, decouple them from all the Power BI data model, and just have, F-string substitution in Python or glue in R, substitute whatever you're selected into the query, run that, populate a grid.
Yeah.
A bunch of these are that. And the hoops that Power BI developers will jump through in order to do some of these is just astounding, because that's their hammer, right?
Yeah.
So that's the issue of what shape is the problem. And they'll look at it and go, oh, I recognize that shape. I should do it with this tool. And I'm like, let's think about this just a minute. I'm not saying you shouldn't, but let's make sure we really understand what shape it is before we assume that's the right tool for doing it.
Yeah, what was I going to say? The problem is really, you got to define it, right? Like, is it, do I need an answer now? Are we building something long-term for the future that's going to be replicable? All of this stuff, because it really does change. I am personally very guilty of something, a simpler example of what you were just talking about, where it's like, yeah, I should probably do this in the database, and I should do this transformation in the database, but I'm in Power BI right now, so I'll just do it in Power BI, right? Like,
Yeah.
And then it's like, oh, well, no, we should just go implement this in the database, so we're not doing all this extra shit.
Yeah.
Do you all have a roadmap of how you think from moving from sort of a piece of it like analyst analysis to, for lack of a better term, we'll call it production, but I don't want to get in a big debate of what production is, because I don't know.
Well, I do want to talk about that, because that's probably one of my favorite data tweets is that you have, is about the whole Excel being in production thing. But yeah, I mean, again, like I said, I think I take a lot of way I think about data and how I manage it now, like at our company, like, kind of from stuff that you've talked about. But I mean, like, we've got analysts in each of our different kind of functional groups, but we have like a weekly meeting where we're understanding what they're working on. So making sure we're not reinventing the wheel, or that they know we're already exposing that. But again, like John said, like, I view Excel, Spotfire, Power BI, these are great prototyping tools. And I need those people. And if that's their tool that they can do their work in, that's great. But once I realize that they're making business decisions on it, and this is something that someone else needs to leverage, like I need to take that logic and pull it back into the data warehouse. And we're going to calculate it there because it's going to be faster. I can materialize that answer as like a table or an output, and they can pull it in much more quickly and efficiently.
You also have that element of QA QC control too, right? Like that's a big thing.
It's institutionalizing the knowledge, right?
Right.
I mean, and again, it all comes full circle. We're using DBT now. It's in source control. So any of these key metrics or calculations, like people are getting it from the same spot. I've kind of gotten to the point where we use a lot of TIBCO, Spotfire, Power BI, and people are going to use that on the edge. It's inevitable. Excel, but I've been saying it like I want people to be drinking out of the same faucet, but I don't care if they use a tumbler or a glass or a coffee mug, whatever, but you're going to get the answer from the same spot and it's going to be calculated the same way.
Let me state this a different way and tell me if we're talking about the same thing. I'm pretty sure we are, but you basically want the business logic being done in an ETL process that's version controlled and dumping into database. And then you want the display to have very minimal logic and is basically pivoting, transforming just the shape of it, but not doing quote unquote business logic.
Absolutely.
Yeah. That's the religion I've come around to after years of doing this. And one of the things that's really, that I, kind of fight a little bit against is that's a good idea. And as soon as a user opens Power BI, the thing they're prompted to do is start transforming their data.
Yeah,
and
that's very true.
And I have this debate with a buddy of mine who works at another company, and his argument is yeah, but that's a huge improvement over the crap they were doing in Excel. And I'm like, fair. That's fair, right? He's like, at least it's reproducible. And I'm like, true. And you all are on a different point in the maturity of your data organization than we are. And for the folks on my team, I don't want them doing that. I want them writing Python, usually orchestrated by Airflow in our shop and dumped into a database, and then have the whatever reporting tool they're using. And the reporting tool, sometimes it's best is a pivot table in Excel, but I don't want any logic there. I just want it presenting data, or they may be writing an SSRS report, or they may be, a web app of some kind. But to your point, Bobby, it's all pulling from the same data. So it's one source of truth. And you can see what transforms went into that data by looking at the code that should be readable by everyone in the organization who might want to.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's the beautiful thing about, DBT. And I know there's been a lot of, hate on the modern data stack, this and that. But as far as I'm concerned, SQL is that lingua franca that, a lot of people can read, and, people have access to our data, our lineage, and they can go see the code that transformed what they're using. So there's some, transparency there.
I like the literate programming kind of thing. Well, literate programming. I like that you use the same source to build the data and then it creates the documentation.
Yeah.
I don't use DBT in anger much. I've just looked at it, but I literally have not built a single thing that's in our system using DBT because we already had a bunch of stuff that
Airflow
worked to solve that problem, right? We already had Python code, we already had Airflow, and so it was we didn't really have the problem that gives people the incentive to initially grab it. But we've done some spikes with it. And I think the generation of the documentation is some of the neatest bit of kit in there that I think a lot of folks sort of don't pay as much attention to because they're so excited that they can do so much with just SQL. And I think those of us who have maybe more tools in our toolkit, that bit's a little less exciting. And some of the other bits are maybe more exciting.
Yeah, no, 100%. Because I think that is people sleep on the full ecosystem of that. You get the documentation, you get the lineage, and now they have column level lineage. And it's just be able to trace those things up and down, and even and to test the data. Which again, you can write tests obviously in Python, but again, that's something people are definitely not doing in their BI
Guilty
tools.
as charged.
Yeah.
No, I think what Bobby has kind of described is looping us back to the low code stuff, right? That to me is the optimal pipeline, right? The last company I worked for was a edge computing startup, and in my journey in the sales side to frame our presentations and our pitches, the best analogy for what we were doing at that time was this is basically low code, no code, but for hardware. We had these Kubernetes clusters that we could stand up on the edge that They were literally like Legos. You could stack 3 on top, and now you had a full cluster. But you could literally push button deployment, right? Like I was deploying Kubernetes. I don't know shit about configuring Kubernetes. I have no business touching it, but I could stand up a kube cluster very easily. But like, so anyway, the data that I researched on all of that stuff talks about the reason people like or low code is taking off is, the business, the SME, whoever that may be, business analyst, et cetera, it gives them the ability, because they know the problem, they know what they're trying to figure out. Whereas a developer or just a pure data scientist that doesn't know the context or the industry per se doesn't. It allows them to go in and actually build ways to solve their problems or find the answer, whatever it may be. And then it's like, so doing that with Power BI, where it's like you guys serve the data up to the user, they can build out the dashboard to a certain extent how they want it. Then you guys take that and basically turn it into code and productionize it so that it's just this nice feedback loop, right? And that's how it should work, right? Give them the ability to solve the problems, then figure out what they're doing, then take it and productionize it so that it's across the company almost.
Let's poke on that just a little bit, because this is a classic, what's the shape of the problem? Like, I think the problem we're solving is a communication problem.
Yes.
And, it's like the folks who understand the business and understand what the stuff means are over here, and they often lack the technical tooling to do what this group of people do over here on the technical side. And I really feel like the single biggest value of the data science movement of the last 12 years is putting a whole bunch of us in the middle, where it's okay to not be completely this and not be completely that. I mean, when I was first doing stuff that looked like data science, I had to fight, lie, and steal to try to get tooling on my machine, because we had been part of, I was with a company that had been part of GE, and they had a huge amount of rules around what you could have on your computer, and I wasn't allowed to have programming language.
Right.
Right. So I had to do VBA, because that's Excel, right? That's what people in the business are allowed to have. You can't have R or Python, right? And that's just insanity. And because of data science, folks are coming out of college now, having had that and seeing the usefulness of these tools, and companies everywhere, don't see this as a problem. That's just, and many of them have hosted environments for doing this. That's a huge structural change versus a number of years ago. And it's like, what we're trying to solve is we now have people who can write some code and they're close to the business, right? So, it's funny, you described the data scientist maybe being more like a developer and they don't understand the business problem. I have a really strong religious belief that your data scientists should be in the business, not in any other group, and they should be domain experts.
100%.
Because I way think that more than they should be code first. They should be able to get things done with code, but I really want them, and maybe I'm just biased because that's kind of who I am. I came into it all from the business side and then learned just enough coding to be effective and get things done.
That's where I'm at too. So I might be a little biased as well, but
so we may all be having confirmation bias right here, right?
Well, no, but I mean, I think that's a good segue too, because I want to kind of get into how you kind of got into this space. But I know you've talked a lot, and we like to talk about people's journey, and maybe a good path for people like into data or into the tech world or whatever. But you've talked about, I think before, like you came in and you just had to be useful. And that's kind of how I felt too. Like I came in, like I was a high school teacher and a coach, and I got lucky enough that someone said, you should be in oil and gas. And I came in and they're like,
which happens to high school teachers in Texas and Texas only.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah. And I showed up, my elevator pitches, I didn't even know what a VLOOKUP was. I walked in and they're like, oh yeah, just do a VLOOKUP. I'm like, wait, you got to slow down. I don't, but you're gonna be a data guy, but I didn't know data science was a thing. And then all of a sudden that was 2014, right? The whole Time magazine, and I was like, well, that's cool. Let me lean into that. And you find, but I think the biggest thing is you got to find ways to help the business solve problems. Like I've talked to a couple other people trying to follow a similar path that I did. They come out of teaching. I'm like, look, it's great that you got this Python certification from Google, whatever. Like, do not go get a data job. Get into a business and find a way to improve their outcomes. Like, how can they report more frequently? How can they, get more visibility or automate things? And if you start solving those problems, you're going to make yourself useful, and you're going to, that's
you're also
going to
be
carve your niche.
Sticky.
Yeah.
It's going to be very hard for them to get rid of you. That's
it almost feels like a career moat. We've come full circle.
Yeah.
It's true.
Yeah, you do become sticky because you're just so dang useful. I got some really like crazy good advice from my dad when I was like a junior or senior in high school. So I graduated high school in 91. So this had been like 89 or 90. My dad, I grew up on a farm, but my dad had been in the Air Force. He was a pilot. And sort of his second career was farming. And we always had computers around the house. Dad was very into computers and did a bunch of computer work at the Air Force as a reservist. And, I was like, oh, I want to go into computer science. My dad was like, no, you don't. I watch you. You want to play like Larry Bird versus Dr. J on your Commodore Amiga. You don't want to code. You're just like, you've shown no desire to figure out coding. You've done like the equivalent of bash script on my Commodore Amiga. I can't even remember what it was called. But anyway, he's like, you've done a little bit of that, but mainly because you wanted it to do something cute. You don't really live and breathe coding. What you should think about doing is solving technical problems like from within a business or industry that you find interesting, and then use computers to do that.
Yeah.
And I'm like, shit,
that's definitely
in retrospect,
very prescient.
It's like,
yeah.
That's like data science, right?
Yeah.
Without any structure around it, just at its core. And I started college as an agricultural as an agricultural engineer. And I quickly learned that my rural school system in my class of 51, I was woefully underprepared in math and science from rural West Kentucky. I imagine you guys find that shocking, but I just about drowned in, physics and calc. And I sort of pulled back and said, what the hell am I doing? And ended up in an agricultural, I think it was like a rural sociology class. And I was like, I didn't know anything about social sciences. And I'm like, this is actually really interesting. And ended up an agricultural economist. And then I took econometrics as part of that, which for folks who don't know, linear regression. And I was like, this is really interesting, right? And I did my my keystone or capstone project in econometrics on what are the factors that drive commodity prices, and discovered it's interest rates, because it drives import exports. Yeah. And it drives commodity price up and down. And, as a 19-year-old, I didn't know that. Or maybe I was 20 or something. I didn't know that. And I was like, holy shit, I just used this tool to actually learn something about something I care about. And that was really like the switch going off, that this stuff is really useful. Now, obviously, there's theory and other people knew all this, but I didn't. And I was able to figure it out with this tool. And that really, I learned a little SAS, and then I learned some Excel, and then ended up like a summer project helping migrate some data at the College of Agriculture off of SAS tapes, I think it was, using like the data control language and into a Unix mainframe. Sorry, coming off of an IBM mainframe, moving into a Unix cluster, like some kind of HP cluster. And that was kind of the start. And then one of the things I noticed is my major professor I did my master's work under, he was one of the few who wrote his own code. A lot of them worked with they called them, I can't remember if they're programmers or I think they were called programmers, but they would have an assistant who implemented what they wrote down. And the folks doing the analysis didn't actually code it. And what I watched Dr. Jerry Skis at University of Kentucky do is he was doing it all himself, and he would discover things he wasn't looking for. And the other faculty, I felt like, didn't have those epiphanies or those kismet moments because they weren't like exploring the data themselves. Right. They would be like, here's a theory, here's a chunk of data. I want you to code this up and test this hypothesis. And it was like either fail or, not fail to reject or whatever. And they didn't get any learning. And so what I later would learn is Jerry would do a bunch of stuff that was effectively EDA, right? Exploratory data analysis. And he would figure things out, or he'd figure out, I got data quality issues. Meanwhile, a lot of these other folks didn't, and their programmers didn't know to look for these things, or what, and it was more like what we're talking about in business, where the, software developers and the business people had a chasm and they were passing notes back and forth. Well, Jerry was both of those. And I'm like, he's terribly effective.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I was like, that's just what you do, because that's effective. And, then the other piece of very prescient advice my dad gave me was get useful quick.
Yeah.
When I went into the workplace. And so I found that having a handful of these tools I could be really useful really quick because we didn't have to pull in a software developer. Now, we weren't writing software. We were often doing stuff that could be done in Excel or in a, Access database. I mean, this was, by the time I hit the workforce, I worked at the university for a while and that to help pay for graduate school. And so I ended up spending as long getting a master's as some of my friends did to get a PhD. But I only have a master's degree because I worked. And then, so about 2001, I hit the workforce and I just thought this is how you do it, right? This is how you get things done. And then later found out some companies don't like that, right? They don't expect that. They don't want you, writing something that looks like code. That's not your lane. You're supposed to be in your lane over here, and somebody else is supposed to be in that lane. I'm like, no, but that's less effective because there's all this communication friction.
Right, but I'm also solving a problem, right? Which is at the root what you want me to do, right? Like that's why you're paying me a salary. Yeah, no, that's
I think this is a good. Well, that's a couple things there. I think you've talked to. I think because didn't Access at one time, or there still is there's kind of that GUI to generate SQL, right? Technically, I mean, and that was the way a lot of people were learning SQL back then.
That's totally how I learned to do SQL. Was Microsoft Access had like a drag and drop. You'd see your table with your list of fields and you drag a field and drop it on the other one and it would make a join based on that field. And you would see down below it, write the SQL. That's literally how I learned to write SQL. I can't believe you remembered that.
Yeah. And then I think some other things there too. I think we're starting to butt up on like a shadow IT conversation. And I think, it's almost like you talk about moats, and I think they try to put their moat around themselves. But like the thing is, when you have problem solvers like yourself or me, or I work with a ton of engineers, and John's an engineer. He's done a lot of sales, but he's an engineer by degree and mindset. Like if you put something in their way, they're going to find a way around it.
Yeah, it's like the internet. The internet, if there's blockage, it'll treat it as an obstruction and route around it.
Yeah. That's also the fastest way for me to be motivated to go get around something too, is by you putting something up where I don't think it should be. Right? Like
that's my tendency to blow moats up or go over them or what. Yeah,
a little bit of an anarchist built into a lot of us, where it's just because it's like, okay, well, this is an unnecessary problem. I'm trying to solve a problem, and you're just throwing shit in front of me that is slowing it down.
Let's talk about shadow IT real quick. And I got to start this with a caveat. I actually got myself in a little trouble with that comment on Facebook because some of the people I work with now, there was some potential for hurt feelings because they thought my engineers I work with now thought I was criticizing. I'm like, no, we don't have shadow ID. What are you talking about? And I'm like, so I'm not talking about RenaissanceRe when I have commented publicly about shadow IT. I'm really talking about some prior experiences and the experiences I see a lot of my peers having. So the shadow IT concept is basically when the people in the business can't get what they need from their software team, so they start doing things that the IT side of the house thinks is their job. And it almost always stems out of someone on the business side can't get the things they need or can't get them fast enough. And instead of seeing it as a failure of IT to be responsive to the business needs, the IT often sees it as like a rogue security threat and approach it as such. And sometimes it is, but it's a little like, I know some people who express hurt feelings comes across like anger.
Yeah.
And it's a little bit like that. It's like you're seeing something and there's some security issues there, but what you're really seeing is your own failure. Mm-hmm. Your own being the IT side of the house to give the business the tools they need. And they have often put in so much friction in getting work done that they made it impossible for folks to get work done. So as John said, the business routes around them.
Yeah.
Because they aren't helping, they're hurting. And this actually, the way we have solved this at RenRe is I don't want to speak for other folks. My experience has been, I don't want to speak for RenRe, but the way I have observed this being effective is partnership. Mm-hmm. I meet every 2 weeks with our head of platform operations. I'm in the business.
Yeah.
Why? So we can get stuff done.
Yep.
And we always have something to talk about. And if I was having to interface with her through submitting tickets, I'd pull my fucking hair out.
Yep.
Yeah.
No, that's,
and
well, I think people
she's
get
great.
People get that people talk a lot about IT being, a cost center and all this stuff, and they're always in the way. And it's because the structure almost forces that, right? Like they're in their IT silo and your directive is security or whatever it may be, right? So it's like, okay, well, I'm going to lock this shit down. It's like, well, that doesn't fit with the other person.
Then you're going to do something even more risky to get the job done, right?
So this is a misunderstanding of optionality, right? And I see legal teams do the same thing. They get no benefit from the upside, but they feel like the downside is completely their risk. They feel like their career is selling puts.
Yeah.
So they don't want any exposure on the downside.
Yep.
Because but they don't give a shit if it makes your life really hard, because that's not their job.
Yeah. As long as my risk, it's all about the risk, right?
As long as we completely remove risk.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And once again, that's not my problem at RenaissanceRe where I currently am at all, but I've seen it up close.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I've seen lawyers who just, I think, said no to everything. I was at an insurance company and the lawyers would say no to anything.
Yeah.
And it's like, they're like, oh, what, there's risk. It's like, do you know what we do for a living?
Yeah. We evaluate risk.
Literally value risk and sell protection risk. Like that's what we do. Why can we not treat this risk, understand the size of it and talk about the trade-offs? Is it worth the risk that we're taking? And I was really surprised later in my career when I met attorneys who think like that.
Yeah.
Who are like, well, this is an aggressive stance, but if this benefit, outweighs this potential downside, I think we should go for it or whatever. And it's like, these people think right. They're thinking like, risk and distributions of risk and thinking about the benefits and the cost of that. And our IT folks often do as well. They see just the risk of, well, there's a potential security risk, right? Well, I can eliminate all potential security risk, but it'll involve taking all these machines and running them through a shredder and piling the bits up in the corner of the office. But otherwise, there's going to be some risk. So now that we all agree that there's going to be some risk, let's talk about what risks are acceptable and what value we need to see, right? So anyway,
no, that's a big thing. I know it's not unique because I'm just a big proponent that most business problems are not unique regardless of the industry.
They really
but
are.
Our industry as a whole, from top down, everything is approached based almost exclusively off of risk, right? It took me a while to figure this out. Someone once told me, they were like, Facebook's algorithm going down doesn't really affect your daily life, but a well blowing out and killing people, that's a real thing, right? Like that's a huge issue. That's a legit risk. And so our industry is very hesitant about technology implementation. I won't say adoption, because we invent a lot of really cool shit and we test a lot of stuff early, but we're going to be a slow adopter because in most cases there's this inherent risk component, right? And so life is risky, right? Like you can't, it's the whole,
we all get in a car, which is like the most risky thing we'll do all year.
Yeah. The people that are afraid of flying, and it's like, oh, well, that's a hell of a lot safer than driving. Like go drive in Houston traffic for long enough.
Yeah.
And you'll see.
Exactly we could get into a whole world of like cognitive bias discussion here, right? But kind of backing up a little bit, I think this idea of thinking about trade-offs is really powerful, and making sure that everyone involved in the decision has some ownership in both sides of it.
You gotta get rid of the silos.
Because in the silo, everybody's just responding to the risk, right?
Yeah,
and
IT should be
they don't feel
enabling. IT is an enabler. They're not a moat. Right?
Oh, and one of the things that we did is I think is really great, and this was completely done by my IT side of the shop, is they literally have a group called Cloud Enablement. That's trying to take the friction out.
Yeah.
And it's like, amen to that. I had no involvement in it, right? In the creation of it. I have involvement with them, but I didn't, create that or anything. I think it's a great idea, right? Like we should have more enablement. That's the upside. That is teams trying to help the business get the business done. That's what we need more of.
Yeah. IT should build a moat around the company. Right. So people aren't trying to get in, but within the company, they shouldn't build a moat around everything. They should enable the company because that's what they're there to do. And Bobby and I we had a security guy on a couple of weeks ago. I don't know how long it's been, but he was talking about like, okay, you put up all these external blockers. It's like almost all of the risk comes from internal, right? It's like someone gets a fucking phishing email, and then they have access to the account, and then they
click the button.
Yeah, they click the button, and now the next thing you know, they're getting emails from the CEO asking them to buy Target gift cards or transfer money to this new account. right? And it's like, that's way riskier in a lot of situations than, letting an engineer have access to a data table that he needs access to. Like,
so let me back up in our conversation and scratch on one thing that we kind of blew by, and that is like how do we move stuff from an analyst has figured out how to solve a problem, but it's baling twine, duct tape, and bubble gum, right?
Yeah.
And Excel centric, and they run a query over here and copy and paste the results into the Excel spreadsheet. How do we go from there to something that I don't know if it's production, but it's at least well controlled and more behaved? Do you guys have a design pattern you like?
I mean, again, for us, I mean, like we try to fit most of it like into DBT, so we'll try to take whatever they built, the logic that they built, and back out again into a source controlled spot, and then again we serve out our production tables through like a certain schema. So we have like a kind of a gold, if you were gonna call it a medallion architecture, it'd be like your gold layer. But but pretty much most of the company has access to those that are kind of those tables or views that have been vetted and have gone through the ringer a little bit, and then that way it can be served out. But it's, again, you've really got to iterate and understand what people have built and what they're using, because you quickly get the temporary but permanent solution, which, and again, then it comes down to how do we define production, which...
John, do you guys do this? Do you guys move it from that, or do you just basically try to hide so no one knows that you have this this gubbins held together with baling wire?
You're looking at the DW data engineer, analyst, and IT support person.
Yeah, he's doing all of it right now.
You do all of it?
Yeah, we have 12 people. So my pipeline is my boss comes over and says, I want to know this metric, so I update the dashboard with that metric, or I need this report or whatever. It's much easier at this size. But
when you're a one-man shop, it's a whole different beast. But now, I mean, even in the last couple of months, I've brought in like 3 different people like on my team or people like in the business, and it's a whole different beast. Once you've got a bunch more users and hands in the pot and everything, just you've really got to start tightening things up. But it's always that push and pull, like you're saying, those trade-offs of like how much access do I give these people? But also, I don't want to be the one keeping them from getting their job done.
Right.
And I've allowed more people have access to the data warehouse, but with that, I've had to put, I put together like a pull request template where they have to show that they've done certain things to.
Oh, that's excellent.
To make sure that they're doing the proper things before they push it through, and that just, and then it's got to go be reviewed by me and or one of our senior developers. To ensure a certain quality of code. Again, we're not super rigorous, but you need something, but it's hard to, I think we're going through that medium-sized company thing, and John and I've talked about it. Like when you're small, like John, your team can move fast, you can break things and it's fine. And then you get to this intermediate, you're like, man, I don't want to become like Fortune 500 bureaucratic and everything's locked down. But at the same time, we need to have some rigor around everything. Make sure that there's a standard that we hold our company and the developers to.
Even at a company of our size, like I said, 12 or 13 people, whatever it is, right? Like it's very easy for most of us are also in the same office, for someone to be like, hey, can you update this on the website, or update this in HubSpot, or update whatever it is. And it's like, yes. Can I do that right now though? No. So now we've got to figure out a system so that your requests can get in a queue and I can actually get to it at some point, because it's not a high priority. It's just an idea that you have, but the idea is great, right? Like, yes, this makes a lot of sense to have that metric somewhere, add this field or whatever. And so it's like, I've implemented the same thing. We use ClickUp for all of it's kind of like Jira. We use ClickUp for all of our development stuff, all of our project management stuff. They now have like basically a full-blown Notion replica in there as well for documentation and all this. It's really powerful because it's a pseudo no-code type platform.
Right. But it sounds like it's scratching a bunch of really useful itches, right?
Well, that's the thing, right? It's like, okay, well, if I'm documenting and doing projects, I also need form generation. Oh, they've got forms. I also need documentation. Oh, they've got documentation. I need a mind map. Oh, they've got that built in too, right? Like, so it's got all these things. But even as small as the company we are, like, there's a bunch of pinned links to different forms for different requests in our Slack channels, because that's the only way to, as you scale, even at a small company, right? Like shit's coming in all the time from every different direction. And so it's like, yes, we can move fast, but there's always something to do. There's always something broken or needs to be fixed or added or whatever. And so even, at small scale, just being able to document, because in my experience, mostly working on the startup side, like so much of that shit just gets lost. Like you have a conversation about it at a meeting or at lunch or wherever, and then it's just like,
and it just gets lost.
Or they throw it in a Slack channel. And it's like, okay, well, great.
Right.
What is that going to do?
Which is lost.
Yeah, exactly.
But I repeat myself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, absolutely.
We've gotten just big enough that we think about this, and it's really consistent kind of with both, I think with John, what you and Bob both said. Our organizations are at different points. I mean, kind of John on the small side, Bobby on the medium, and we're large financially, but medium by head count. I mean, the whole organization's 1,000 people. But the thing we've seen is we think about a continuum, and maybe it starts with like an analyst figuring something out in Excel, and that's very iterative, very high flexibility, very low control. Mm-hmm. And then maybe the next layer of rigor is the group I'm in, solutions, we're going to have our stuff in version control. It's going to be more code, less copy paste. It's going to be automatable, most likely. It'll be run by Airflow, but less robust than our gold standard, which is when our IT devs build a proper product out of it. So we understand that's a continuum, and what we've broken ourselves from is this group looking downstream and saying your solutions are illegitimate.
Yeah.
They're not illegitimate. They're making different sets of trade-offs for different reasons.
Right.
And we all know what those are, and we talk about them openly. And so, if we're having problems here because we don't have enough controls, we need to go here. Or some solutions will never be used until they're here. So like if you think about what feeds your GL needs to not be built down here and probably doesn't even need to be built here. Like that shit's got to be right. Yeah. And, but however, like a metric on an internal dashboard might be fine to just be created here in the middle. Yeah. If it's not like we're going to report financial earnings wrong if it goes down for a day or something, right? So we have different levels of reliability. We have different levels of validation. We have different levels of, error checking and error handling as we go up that continuum. And nobody is looking at each other saying they're illegitimate. We're just trying to get things in the right place. Now, a couple of things that started kind of as a joke that have become like things we just do. One is we do this thing in the middle where it's like, it's better than the limp along solution, but it's not the true production. And we call it a Producto-Type.
Nice.
And it's it's a little more than a prototype. And we've been using it for a couple of quarters. I mean, and sometimes Producto-Types are generating stuff that goes to the board of directors.
Sure.
But it hasn't been put into a formalized IT controlled full process, but it's been reviewed. And, one of the things we've done is we've adopted the language of our business. So we're a risk trading organization. So we do a thing with deals called a second set eyes, and we often just abbreviate it SSE. So we do SSEs on all of our deals. So we do that in our solutions group as well. So this would be, instead of saying, we're going to do maybe full code review, well, we're going to get a second set eyes. And that means we're going to sit down with somebody else on our team and explain what we're doing, show them the code. And they're going to say, okay, that makes sense. I see what you're doing. They're not signing off that I have independently validated tests on every calculation, but they're giving you a sanity check, right? Yeah. And that's better than not having that. It's like a souped up rubber duck debugging. You're having to force yourself to at least explain it to another human and them say, that makes sense. That isn't crazy. There isn't anything obviously nuts here. So doing the SSE and second set eyes, it moves us from like the typical analyst to this thing that's kind of in the middle, right? And that's a little bit, Bobby, like you guys are talking about doing, adding a little bit of controls around that.
Bobby is my SSE. I wish I had one internally. You're right. I know, but you're right. Like I feel like that's almost human nature, right? Like I think this is right, but can just someone that I trust give me some kind of validation, help poke holes in it?
Yeah, and especially as you're learning to do a new tool or a new library or something, it's like, is this the way to do it? Or should I be thinking about this problem differently? And it's also a good opportunity for mentorship, right? Because you have your more senior people doing SSEs with your more junior people, and they'll see things, oh, well, let's talk about how to do this more efficiently, right? Or, hey, there's actually this design pattern was worked out over here. Let me show you in this other repo a design pattern that gets you the same thing easier or something, and so it becomes like real-time learning and mentoring, which, is how we build people.
No, for sure. And talking about John reaching out to me, it kind of brings up the whole low code thing too. That was this past week, John, you reached out and he had done the same exact thing in Power BI and in Looker. And like the grand totals were different, but the tables looked exactly the same.
I went through and hand calculated it multiple times. Fortunately, it was only a month's worth of data, and it was just daily data, right? So like it was, but I was in bed, like in my bed, 9:30, my laptop open, my phone out, literally calculating each row of one table and then doing the exact same thing. I handed the phone to my wife and she called the numbers to me. I called them to her because I was just like, what is happening?
Yeah. This is stuff that gets the hashtag why daddy drinks, right?
Yeah. And it's like,
so what ended up being the cause? You can't bring me here and not resolve this tension.
So I had just like the two data tables next to each other, and then the sums at the bottom, right? And then I was like, oh, well, let me see what other transformations are available in Looker for this data set. And there's a running total transformation. So I copied the table, changed that one to running total, and looked at it. The last number matches the number from the Power BI data set, but doesn't match the sum,
the grand total
of that same data set. It is bigger than the sum in that data set. And I'm like, well, that just shows it that it's wrong. Like that's how I ultimately figured it out in conjunction with the calculator. But it was just like, what is happening? And it's something to do with, first of all, only use Google products that lots of people use because things like Looker are horrible for a reason. But it was something with how the SQL under Looker, understands time or calculates sums over time. I don't know why or how.
Yeah,
or whatever.
I think it was almost like their version of DAX. I want to say where like if it doesn't do the filter on it does like the total on the full data set, not
without the filter, not the filter data set.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. I just wanted this range of data, and I want the sum of that data from this range. Yeah. And that's exactly what it was.
This is an example of you had an abstraction and it leaked all over your foot. Right.
Yeah. Well, like, fortunately, I was using Power BI as my main dashboard and stuff anyway, but one of my counterparts who was on the marketing operations side was using this, and we were both pulling from, it was Google Analytics data. We're both pulling the same data set from the same source. She was using Looker and I was using this one, and they just didn't match. I was like, what is happening?
But that's scary too, because if someone doesn't know what they're using, I mean, like they're making, assumptions or business, decisions off of that. Like,
this is the rise of the metric store right now. In this case, I'm not sure a metric store would have solved this exact problem, but the idea, what we often see is, a loss ratio is something that we calculate in insurance and reinsurance all the time. It's, losses divided by premium. So you want it less than 1, right? To make money.
Yeah.
If it's bigger than 1, you're paying out more in losses than you're bringing in premium. So premium divided by, losses divided by premium. Yeah. So anyway, there's often something like, okay, well, what if you do a no claims bonus? Does that come out of the numerator or the denominator? Right? Like, what do you add in one or do you subtract it from the other? And if you don't have some common place where a bunch of this is calculated, everybody will calculate it differently, or you'll know of 2 ways to calculate it and the users will figure out 2 more. So there'll be 4 different ways of calculating this floating around your organization. And you'll spend I've been in executive meetings where folks were spent half of it trying to figure out why 2 numbers don't match. Right? That's the last place you want to be, right? You're not making any business decisions. You're just debugging your reports live at $10,000 an hour.
Yeah. Well, to that point though, that's the value of having that second set of eyes, because it really had I not been here, she would have built that dashboard and that's what they would have used. And then at some point they would be like, what is happening? Like something would not have matched from the raw set. And then, but yeah, it's It's always good to have someone curious about the data, looking at the data anytime that you're dealing with the data. So instead of
I tell my analyst, I'm like, anytime you have that feeling that's kind of usually manifests itself inside my head as, that's weird.
Yep.
Your job is to resolve that.
Yeah.
I tell them, in my job, right? It's like every bug I've ever found, every screw up I've ever made, every one I even ignored and it later blew up on me. There was some point where I had like I would not have expected this quarter that number to go down. Oh, well, right. No, you just presented something that was wrong. And
trust but verify. That's the
exactly. And if you get, and well, this is the value of seniority and experience, right? Is you have a more refined heuristic in your head that goes, or immediately, let me validate that number against this over here. Okay, those don't match. They should. Yeah. And a young analyst or a new person, they don't have the intuition. So they look at it. It doesn't feel wrong to them because they don't feel anything. Right? Yep. It's a bunch of numbers. There's some on the left of the period and there's some on the right. I don't know. And they also don't know where they can quickly validate it. And they've got no intuition around it, right? So this is part of why, we get paid more as we get older because we build a bunch of this intuition.
Yeah. Well, and luckily, like I had a similar experience, but it ended up I had done the calculation right, but I did something, but I kept checking and it worked, but it seemed too easy. And I was like, nah, because I was just adding a condition to like a case statement, but there was a lot of kind of nested. And I was like, there's no way it was that simple. Like I need you to check.
That's because you've had a lot of trauma in your life and you should talk about that with your therapist. Because that's the trauma speaking. It's like, oh, this didn't hurt. I must be doing it wrong.
It's true but like that's people always, they talk about failing fast and stuff. And one of our last guests was talking about, it's like, we need to completely get rid of that failure word, right? And it's learning. Right. It's iteration is really
iterating
truly
fast,
what
right.
it is.
Yeah, it's back to iterating, right?
It's not failure. As long as you learn from it and it goes into your experience bank and you're like, oh, the next time that happens, like Posy, it's like, oh, well, maybe I should look at this. Or like it throws that flag off, then it helped, right? It didn't hurt you.
Well, I think this iterating, we're back to our conversation we started with, there's people who know business and people who know the development and then they, are passing notes back and forth to each other. And the problem with that, and I think the problem with maybe even agile development as it's currently being presented, this isn't how it originally started, but it's adding so much formality to that it almost acts like discovery in the process of development doesn't happen. You work all that out ahead and then you just execute it. And like, that's completely malformed based in my life experience. I have never worked on a project that worked like that. I mean, everything from working on my old Jeep to, building stuff in, inside of a major corporation, none of it works like that. Yeah. You've got all this uncertainty you're trying to figure out. You think you understand kind of how something works, and then it punches you in the face and you realize it doesn't work like that. So you have to change how you're thinking. And if you're people who understand the business are over here and are just writing their request on a node or helping create a user story, and then a developer is supposed to go off and do it, you're just missing that iteration, that fast, high, low friction, high fidelity, high speed problem solving. I had a retrospective with one of my peers at one point about a project, and we got it done. It was okay. But he said, if I had to do that again, I would have taken one developer and myself, and we would have just blocked a conference room and moved in for 2 weeks. And we could have gotten done, the two of us, in 2 weeks, what, it took a whole team of 3 or 4 to do in a couple months. And he said, just because there was not fast enough iteration, not high enough bandwidth of communication. And I'm not meaning any insult to anybody. Everybody had best intentions. Yeah. It's just the idea of talk to me and then go away for even a couple days and then come back and talk to me isn't, if you haven't gotten rid of the technical uncertainty, that's too slow.
Yeah.
You need faster.
I like that you use the term fidelity, and that's a great way to describe that, right? Is it's like, there's way more fidelity than just, a request in a forum or a user story, right? Like I've gotten into the practice of anytime we do any kind of development that has any kind of GUI related to it, there's a mock-up with it.
Absolutely.
Because you cannot put a mock-up into words where every single person that reads that will interpret it the same way.
Yeah.
Impossible. Right?
Yeah.
Like
I think the UI folks call it like a wireframe.
Yeah, a wireframe or mock-up, whatever it is.
Yeah, mock-up.
Like, if I'm making a request that there's a new feature that requires something visual, I'm now, every time we do it, it has a mock-up with it because I've gone through that so many times. And because the developers, to your point, a lot of developers want the coding challenge, not the end use challenge of figuring out whatever the big problem is. They want to figure out, how do I code it and check the box off of my list so I can go code the next thing. And so it's like, well, yeah, the function's there, but it's unusable from a normal person because you buried it in a menu or you put it somewhere weird or whatever.
7 clicks deep.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so it's that's Bobby and I have run into this. We built a web app using third-party, external developers, and we got to the point in the company where it's like, okay, we want to move faster. Well, do we hire more external developers or we bring someone in-house where it's like, hey, when we want that problem fixed or that thing tweaked or that color changed, I can just go over to his desk and say, hey, hold up real quick. I want to show you something and change this for me. And then it's done. And it's not like, oh, submit a ticket. Well, where did you want the color? Like, there's all these qualifying questions, right? It's like, no, just sit with the person and do it and knock it out.
Yeah. I think there's like, there's something with if you have commodity type work, and an example versus like bespoke work.
Yes.
So commodity type work is, we want this stuff that's written in 3 different frameworks, literally ported to a different framework.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what we just did, right? Here's my no-code app.
I was thinking of that one.
Build it in Ruby.
And you can test everything because it should give the same answers as the existing one, right? So it's like, there's not a need for that fidelity of communication. But if you're doing something new or something ambiguous or something with technical uncertainty or discovery around it, you can't just hand it off.
For sure. It's well, because you just keep iterating on it anyway, and that's that's where the frustration comes. Is it's like, no, I meant it like this, and then they go back and they change it, and then 2 days later they come back with it because it was down in their queue, and it's like, oh, well, that's not exactly how I meant it.
Well, even like, I think the last one, and then we'll probably have to want to jump into our speed round.
Let's do it.
We did it with we had the developer, and we were using time series data coming from sensors. And they ended up building the time series plot off of the updated timestamp in the database because it would come in batches, but it would be 1 second data, but it would come in like 5-10 minute batches. They plotted it. Oh, this is what you wanted. They used the updated timestamp and not the actual sensor timestamp. But they didn't know. But then that was even something that you would fix that in 5 seconds. Yeah.
And you've got to have that iteration, right? And I think to this point, one of the things I want to fall all over myself to point out is, in all these examples, everyone is working from good faith.
Yeah.
And they're trying their best to do the right thing, but we have friction in our communication, or we have lag in our communication, or whatever. So it's not the people that are the problem. It's like, oh, we just need a different way of working together. Or we need a different way of structuring our projects so that everybody can be the best version of themselves, which is what everybody at the table wants to be. I honestly, most of the time, I've worked at some places where I'm not sure that was the case, but absolutely where I am now, there's no nefarious intent. It's just sometimes we don't set ourselves up for success. We set ourselves up for too much friction.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%.
All right. Y'all got a lightning round me?
Yeah. I'm going to go first because I think this is a good one. Favorite video or board game?
Oh, so video game or board game?
Or both. Either one.
Or both. All right. So I don't play board games as much as I would like to because board games require organizing people in real life. And I'm 51 and I can't get enough people organized around me to play board games, but I like the idea of them. I play Call of Duty's zombies on the treadmill, walking at over 3 miles an hour.
That's a great idea.
That's my exercise routine is zone out, shoot zombies in the face, and walk on the treadmill.
That's such a good idea. I need to do that.
You can do the 12% and really 12% incline. Yeah. You can really work up a sweat at 3 miles an hour and 12%. But I tell you what, if you go on mic on the game, people are going to be like, are you sitting on a washing machine? What the hell is that noise? Like, I'm on a treadmill.
No, but it's much harder for me to convince my wife that I need to play video games than it is that I need to go walk on the treadmill. So that's
correct.
A good
it's
life
time
hack.
for me to get my exercise.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
so everybody can get on board with that. And you can't drink bourbon while you do it. That's the only downside. I mean, you could, but it's not very. Yeah.
So I guess with that, I was thinking that was going to be my question. What's your favorite whiskey or bourbon?
So it's a little bit like our discussion of continuums. Whiskey and bourbon has a continuum, right? There's one
Let's
for
go
all
with
seasons.
bourbon because you're from Kentucky, and
I am from. So even bourbon, right? You got a whole continuum. I was just discussing with.
Scotch is gross. Let's be honest.
Scotch is whiskey, right? Yeah, that's taken me a while to get used. I had to go to Europe a bunch to learn to appreciate Scotch. And really, you don't like peat. It's not that you don't like Scotch.
It's 1,000%.
It's the peat.
Yes.
I know exactly what that face means. There's a bunch of Scotches that aren't super peaty.
Yeah.
So anyway, on the whiskey side, the pepper has some rye. That's not a bourbon. Obviously, it's rye, rye whiskey. The pepper ryes have been a punch above their weight, in my opinion. And I'm also of the opinion that everybody needs 3 bottles of bourbon. They need a house bourbon, and that's like a well bourbon. That's something like when somebody comes over the house and they want to pour it on Coke, you don't cry.
Yeah, here's your Jim Beam.
Yeah,
Jim
exactly,
or Jack,
right?
Yeah. And actually mine is Jim Beam Black.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's like $28 a fifth or something in Virginia.
Yeah.
And I'll drink it on the rocks, or you can, if somebody wants to pour it over Coke, I don't care. But if somebody poured Pappy Van Winkle over Coke, I'd punch him in the face.
Yeah.
I've got a fun story about that. I had a buddy help me move. I randomly stumbled across the only bottle of Pappy I've ever seen in a liquor store outside of a bar.
Right.
When I was
I've never seen it
in New York. I had never seen it either. I almost walked out without buying it, and I walked to the door and I was like, I've literally never seen this. I'm an idiot if I don't buy this. And so anyway, I've only drank it. Both my kids were born when I got my master's, and then I've drank it on 1 or 2 other occasions. I had a buddy help me move to the house I was telling you about, and that was like one of the last things we moved was the liquor cabinet, right? So and it was in the car because it's delicate, all that stuff. So we were loading it up, and I pulled out the bottle of Pappy, and I was like, "Oh, well, here, we'll have a drink now that we're done, as a thank you or whatever." And I'm
cringing already.
Well, I just poured them into the highball glasses. Yeah. I didn't have a fridge at that point, so there was just warm whiskey. So he just threw it back. I was like, no. Man.
Did it like a shot?
I
thought he was gonna pour Coke or ginger ale.
It wasn't that bad. Yeah. But he just shot it. I was like, that was like a $50 shot or whatever it was.
Yeah.
And
probably more than that.
I was just like, man. But he was like, it's the best shot I've ever had of whiskey. And I was like, oh.
Yeah. That tasted really nice. Yeah. Well, you wouldn't know. You just shot it. So So I think you need a house, like a well bourbon, and then you need something for special occasions. Mm-hmm. And then you need something with a story.
Yeah.
And your special occasion may be a story, but like I really like stories. So my bourbon with a story is Green River. And it's because my ancestors came down the Green River from East Kentucky into West Kentucky, and with all their possessions on flatboats coming down the Green River, and they got down there and they had family or friends or something, but they didn't have a house yet. So their belongings went in a barn. And as it turned out, it's the 1860s, and some folks didn't like their neighbors during that time. And somebody's barn ended up getting torched and half their belongings burned. And my parents still have a piece of big wood furniture in the house that has charring on discoloration on one side, and it's because it was in that barn that came down the Green River and was in a barn and got charred during the Civil War. So the Green River is, and because of John Prine's song Paradise that talks about going, once you take me back to Paradise City down on the Green River where paradise lay. And the first time I cried during COVID was the night John Prine died.
Yeah.
And all of the stress of like the COVID situation, I just sat in my floor and melted into a puddle the night John Prine died. And so that bourbon reminds me of my ancestors and John Prine. And
that's cool.
Like it.
That's really cool.
Yeah. So then and have something else top shelf. And all you need to do is pick top shelf is just pay till it hurts, and then you that's easy. The one with the story is hard.
Yeah, 100%.
Well, then it becomes a whole nother can of worms where it's like, well, I've got this really expensive bottle. When am I going to drink it? Like you feel bad at times if you like consider drinking it because you're like, well, is this special enough? And you're like, well, wait a minute, I bought this to enjoy it. So who gives a shit?
Have you seen the movie Sideways where they talk about this with wine?
Not in a long time.
But at the end of it, he basically has a styrofoam cup and he's got the bottle of special wine with him, and he's in like the fast food restaurant. He's pouring wine into his, styrofoam cup. And I'm kind of that mindset of I don't keep stuff like that too precious too long.
Yeah.
Because it's save it up a little bit, enough so it's special, but then have somebody over and celebrate whenever something's appropriate. Find a reason to celebrate.
You want to wrap us up, Bobby? One more?
Yeah, let's do one more.
I'm not good at rapid.
No, it's okay.
No, it's all good.
It's good stuff.
All right, you're a pretty big open source guy. What's your favorite open source project?
Ooh.
Favorite open source project? Oh gosh, there's so many to choose from, right? Because I spent so much time in the R ecosystem.
Yeah,
and I am very much in the. I like the what Hadley did with the tidyverse in R, that whole ecosystem. But I also get why some of like the folks who are more core R find it frustrating or don't like his approach or whatever. So I see both things going on there. But I think the dplyr libraries within the tidyverse did a whole bunch of stuff with data manipulation. I mean, the idea behind it is it was going to be a grammar of data manipulation in the same way that ggplot is a grammar of graphics. And I would say Hadley and folks involved in that like succeeded. And I still, I use Python absolutely as much as I use R anymore. Same. And I constantly miss dplyr.
Oh yeah. I'd say if I get a chance to use R, like tidyverse, but to your point, mainly like the dplyr, it's so much better than pandas. I'm sorry. It's just,
the interface is so intuitive to me. And a bunch of stupid stuff that I shouldn't care about, but like I get worn out typing my quotes in,
that stuff matters when you have to use it a lot. It's just like,
this is annoying. In Python, just, quote, comma, and it just wears me out. And I just love how fast I can go in dplyr because I just type fewer quotes and, a number. And I also have the advantage of I used it long enough that I almost think in it. So it's very intuitive. And I find myself sometimes writing SQL like, why the hell is that an error? And realize, you got to put the where condition relative to the group by I forget about it. Because it doesn't matter in dplyr, right? You just, as you think about it, you put it in as long as your group by is above your aggregate, nobody cares. And SQL is a little more finicky.
I think that's a perfect way to wrap it up. JD, thank you so much.
Fantastic. Y'all, it's been a pleasure. I've enjoyed chatting.
Yeah, no, likewise. I mean, so glad I could have you on. Yeah. Or we could have you on.
We'll definitely have you on again and get even deeper into the R verse because there's just so many people in the industry that use it, right? And it's so powerful.
Exactly.
So, thanks so much for your time, man. We really appreciate it.
You bet, guys. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.